Admiral Yamamoto's plan to launch an attack on Pearl Harbor is agreed upon on November 3, 1941.
December 1st, 1941. Japan finalizes the date of its attack on Pearl Harbor as on December 7th, 1941.
December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, a day that President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed would live in infamy. This surprise attack that occurred without a clear declaration of war from Japan infuriated the U.S. and therefore caused it to end its neutral stance on World War II and join the Allies. U.S. waged a total war, not limited, with Japan. The Japanese only lost 29 planes and 55 aircrew, while on the other hand, the U.S. had more than 2,000 casualties, dozens of aircraft destroyed, and 21 ships damaged or destroyed. There were 5 battleships that were either sunk or destroyed. Examples are Oklahoma, the California, and West Virginia. 3 battleships, destroyers, and cruisers were disabled. Also, an additional 188 planes were destroyed.
Quite undaunted from Pearl Harbor, the Japanese continued its expansion into the Pacific. It took Hong Kong, Wake, Guam, and eventually the Philippines, as well as Malaya, the Dutch islands of Java, Borneo, Sumatra, and Celebes, and then Burma. Mid-1942, Japan in control of most of the lands and islands of the Western Pacific and now turned its focus to Australia and Hawaii, only to be eventually pushed back to its own borders.
May 7th through 8th, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first major naval battle in which the opposing fleets didn't sight each other. This was a new type of naval warfare. The use of carriers and their aircraft decided the war. They carried out all combats. Tactically, this was a Japanese victory. However, strategically, it was a U.S. victory because the Japanese were unable to complete their mission for the first time in World War II. By the end of April 1942, the Japanese had been successful with all of their campaigns in the Pacific. The next step was to take Port Moresby in Australia and prepare to isolate it from U.S. aid. Unknown to the Japanese, U.S. intelligence had expected the invasion. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue was leading the Japanese fleet, while Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher the Allied forces. By the end of the battle, the carrier Lexington was sunk, and the other only carrier, Yorktown, was badly damaged. 1 out of 13 destroyers was sunk. The Sims.
June 4, 1942. Unfortunately, the seemingly abundant confidence that the Japanese now lived would lead them to commit their forces in an invasion of Midway Island, a terrible, unwise overextension of their defensive perimeter. It might not have proved so fatal hadn't the operation plan devised by Admiral Yamamoto himself and combined fleet staff been unnecessarily complex, and had not the Americans possessed the radio and cryptographic intelligence assets that they did. By the end of the battle, the Allies had only lost 1 precious carrier, Yorktown, and 1 destroyer, Hammond, while the 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, as well as an additional cruiser, Mikuma, and another heavily damaged Mogami. The end of this battle made the end of any real strategic offensive capability for the Japanese Navy. Eventually, they would be able to rebuild their air wings as well as replace the carriers, but never will they again possess a formidable amount of both large carriers and well-trained air groups. Henceforth, the Japanese would discover the unstoppable increase in U.S. naval might, while they themselves would steadily decline as a major naval power.
Early August 1942 to mid-February 1943. The Battle of Guadalcanal was a decisive Allied victory over the Empire of Japan. The island of Tulagi had been occupied by the Japanese and had had a seaplane base established on it during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. But in June, the Japanese began constructing a massive airbase in the neighboring island of Guadalcanal. Allied intelligence had actually known of the intentions before the first Japanese construction units were stationed. The Allies acted quickly in order to prevent the construction of the full-fledged airbase. During the next couple of months, the waters around Guadalcanal would become the very unlikely scene of the most bitter, long-lasting naval struggle of the Pacific War. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they could not hope to win, as the combatant was far superior in terms of wealth and resources, and the firm determination of the Americans to accept severe naval losses to hold the island gradually overcame the vital cruiser and destroyer strengths of the Japanese Navy.
February 19, 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima was one of the 4 greatest amphibious operations of all time. These include Incheon, Normandy, North Africa, and Iwo Jima. The United States wanted this area because it could serve as a refueling station as well as an emergency landing field for its fleet of B-29 bombers. It also wanted to take control of the 3 airstrips from the Japanese, who had been using these to launch kamikaze attacks. By March 26, 1945, there were a total of 25,851 U.S. casualties. 1 out of every 3 soldiers were killed or wounded, which were necessary to eliminate a Japanese garrison of 21,000 men. This was a turning point in the Pacific theater during World War II.
April 1st, 1945. The Battle of Okinawa was the site of the largest and final confrontation between the United States and Japanese imperial forces during World War II. The United States hoped to capture the island so that it could be utilized as a base where they would stage raids against the Japanese mainland. After 3 months of fierce fighting, the Americans were victorious, triumphant on June 21st, 1945, at a cost of 13,000 dead and 37,000 wounded. The severe perseverance of the Japanese forces contributed to President Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, rather than invade and suffer potentially horrendous losses. It was in fact the violent persistence which was motivated by both military necessity and cultural ideology, as well as the heavy casualties already sustained in the Pacific theater, that convinced President Harry S. Truman that a simple invasion of Japan would bring disastrous results, such as being tremendously costly for both sides. When Truman took office, it was recommended to him that he create a committee to discuss the issues related to the detonation of a nuclear weapon. In early June, the interim committee submitted its recommendation to Truman that the atomic bomb be used against the Japanese without hesitation. Truman approved, and after Japan refused its final surrender ultimatum, issued on July 26, 1945, it was decided to engage the atomic bomb. The very first atomic bomb, Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, and when Japan once again refused the United States' demand for surrender, 3 days later, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. 5 days later, on August 14th, Japan surrendered unconditionally.